My mother often tells the story about a day in her childhood that quite literally changed the very trajectory of her life. It started out as a normal day, not unlike any other for a bright, precocious little black girl growing up in the Jim Crow South. But on this day, something different happened. Her father received a very special visit. It was a familiar face, a white man, someone she'd seen before. But on this day, it soon became apparent that something wasn't quite right. The conversation between the two men were, shall we say, a bit more intense than normal. And then she heard it. Her father's voice rose up bold and resolute, yet calm and firm, when he said quite matter-of-factly, "I didn't raise any daughters to work in a white man's kitchen." With that, the two men parted, and my mother's path to leadership began. You know, it's certainly true that as 21st century Black women, we have infinitely more choices and opportunities than those that were commonly conferred to our mothers and our grandmothers, and certainly those that came many generations before. But as much as things have changed, so many other things have remained stubbornly the same. And if there's one thing that has been absolutely consistent throughout the Black woman's experience in America, it is this: Black women work. It didn't take a woman's movement to infuse us into America's labor market. We've been here all along, and it's here we remain. To this very day, we are still more likely than any other women in America to work. But despite our drive, despite our determination, despite our loyalty to America's labor market, the fact remains that our ability to ascend to official spaces of leadership are exceedingly rare. And it's not because that's someplace that we don't want to be. According to McKinsey and Company and others, quite frankly, Black women are the most ambitious demographic group in the nation. We, more than anyone else, we want that next promotion, and we're willing to do whatever it takes to earn it. So our problem isn't that we're not leaning in. Our problem is that we're being shut out. According to the Center on Talent Innovation, Black women enter the workforce already as experienced leaders. We are some twice as likely as our white female counterparts to have already had experience leading in our communities, doing things like starting youth initiatives, like leading school boards, like heading community service organizations. And of course, we know we come from an entire history that spans until this very day of leading movements that have quite literally changed the world. So yes, we know how to lead. But in spite of our experiences, both inside and outside of the professional sphere, and no matter our credentials and our professional abilities, what we found is that Black women are also more likely than anyone else to say that we've never received any assistance from any senior level colleagues at work when it comes to helping us pierce through and earn a leadership position. It's as if we've been professionally abandoned, left to sink or swim on our own in what sometimes might feel like shark-infested professional waters. So what does this all mean? It means that for Black women especially, we're likely to experience situations in which our aspirations and our abilities fail to align with opportunity. As it stands today, nearly 3 times as many Black women aspire to leadership than is the case among white women. But when we see who actually acquires those positions, 2 very different realities emerge. As it stands right now, nearly a quarter of white women actually acquire senior executive positions, even though just 8% say that's ultimately where they aspire to be. Now, when we compare that to the situation experienced by Black women, we see that only 2% acquire executive leadership positions, even though 22% say that's ultimately where we want to land. Now, I'm not going to sit here today and make the argument that necessarily 22% of Black women should be in executive leadership. But what I will say with confidence is something is horribly wrong with this picture. America is leaving significant levels of talent and ability and brilliance completely untapped. So when we look at the very top of the leadership realm, we find that this problem is magnified. We know that as recently as the year 2000, only 4 white women held the position of CEO of a Fortune 500 company. But by September of 2016, that number had grown more than 5-fold to 22. Now, I would certainly be the first to say that even 22 isn't enough, right? When you compare that to the hundreds of white men who hold those positions, that number really is quite minuscule. However, we're at least moving in the right direction. When you look at the trend of the number of white women who hold these positions, it's actually been going up in recent years. But as it relates to CEOs of color, that number has actually been trending down. So much so that as it stands today, the number of Black CEOs has actually fallen from 12 to now only 5. For Latinos, it's dropped from a high of 13 to now only 9. For Asian Americans, it's fallen from a high of 15 to now just 10. In fact, the realities experienced by these two groups are so divergent that as it stands today, the number of white women who are CEOs actually nearly equals that of the number of all people of color of both genders combined. Now, when we look at specifically the situation experienced by women of color, we see that just 2 hold the position of CEO of a Fortune 500 company. And as to Black women, just 1, the example of Ursula Burns, as the only Black woman who has ever held that position in the entire 60-year history of this list. And even her stellar example is set to come to an end by the end of this year as her company restructures and she is scheduled to be replaced by a white man. Now, what I find particularly intriguing about this situation is, quite frankly, we know better. We know that diversity is good for business. We know that it leads to things like better innovation, more creativity, higher profits, and overall better outcomes for companies. We know this to be the case. But in terms of how it is actually practiced, we find that companies ultimately tend to privilege gender diversity over racial diversity, even though they're both critically important. And what's especially intriguing and interesting and quite frankly ironic about this situation is that as we are here today, this nation is undergoing a tremendous demographic shift. So much so that the majority of babies born in America right now are babies of color. And so as this nation is becoming browner and browner, the reality is that the leadership structures within this nation is becoming whiter and whiter, even if those leadership structures are now more inclusive of women. In 2015, the Working Mothers Research Institute released a report that found in part that white women really didn't believe they had an interest in helping women of color close the leadership gap. So if you happen to be wondering why you should even care about the professional advancement of women who look like me, then let me remind you, your future is intricately linked with our future. Our perspectives, our professional abilities, our loyalty, and yes, our diversity is absolutely essential to making sure that the employers of today and tomorrow have an authentic understanding of the shifting needs and desires of the changing customer base that we are experiencing in today and throughout the future. And so in that way, your professional stability and growth is directly linked to the degree to which the voices, the perspectives, and yes, the leadership of women of color is activated, respected, and acted upon. But beyond that very real dollars and cents implication, let me also remind you that none of us are free unless all of us are free. If you consider yourself to be among those who is in favor of the full liberation of women, a type of liberation that frees us from discrimination and oppression in any and all forms, then you must reject the comfort of the familiar and the seduction of self-interest. None of us should be satisfied with images like this one, shared with the world by an editor who was very satisfied and happy and proud that her entire team was made up of women, but apparently oblivious to the fact that it was completely devoid of women of color. We must all recognize that all women are not white women. And because of that, diversity among women is just as critical, just as necessary, just as vital and imperative as gender diversity is in the broader context. If your gender equality does not include women who look like me, then let me tell you, that's not true gender equality at all. Thank you.